region faces a future with each country confronting its own unique set of challenges and opportunities. The work of these countries will entail both recovering from the pandemic and building resilience to future pandemics and other risks, along with undertakings to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Building back better will be a constant endeavor as the risks will always be there. We have to work for the future we want. This means concerted effort to build back better across all levels, local, national, regional, and global, and should cut across all dimensions, building on the socioeconomic efforts that are already in place to cope with and recover from the onslaught of the pandemic.
The challenge for the region, the long-term challenges have not gone away as well. We must remember that while the pandemic has come along, the existential crisis of climate change, regular disasters in the region, particularly from tropical cyclones, and these things are hugely challenging and continue to be challenging. We have challenges with water supply and sanitation in our region. We have food security challenges. So these things are not going away, and we need to aim with the Pacific, not just to get back to where we were before COVID, but to where we aim to be in the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 in terms of our development aspirations.
I think it's very, today what I feel as a young leader of women organization, that today is very important to help young people to fundraise and to help them to attract more invest in youth initiatives and youth programs. With more detailed answers, but when young people in the process, they will deliver the needed message and the needed solution for the governments and for the international organizations and all stakeholders who can affect the situation. Governments and our dialogues to include all people, and especially women, young people, people with disabilities, a diverse group, and this dialogue should be diverse. And I think in this process, helping advocate to be represented will be very helpful and very important.
Ensuring that we all work together to implement the SDGs and to see how we can work well together in this uncertain time of COVID. It's different from before in advancing the implementation of SDGs. So I hope this was a great opportunity for all of us to rebuild back better. When we say rebuild back better, is not just keep moving forward without looking back and see, okay, where were we? I guess this COVID-19 was time for us. Where were we back then? What are these challenges that we can, see and identify ways and recommendations to implement them, to improve them, and to move forward well together as we go forward.
Welcome to the side event titled Recovering Better from COVID-19 in the Asia Pacific. Good morning to all of those joining in New York, and good evening to those of you in the Asia Pacific. My name is Riccardo Mesiano, and I will be your MC for this virtual event organized by ESCAP and hosted by the government of Fiji, Pakistan, and the Philippines. It is a pleasure to be joined by so many distinguished speakers and participants. Without further ado, let me invite to the floor the Executive Secretary of ESCAP, Ms. Armida Salciali Shabana, for her welcoming remarks. Ibu Armida, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this side event at the High-Level Political Forum, co-organized by the governments of Fiji, Pakistan, and the Philippines, and the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP. The opportunity afforded by HLPF is an important one to engage in a conversation with member states and experts about how the Asia-Pacific region charts a course away from COVID-19. I hope these discussions can build on the dialogue at the recent session of the Commission, where we highlighted the need for a green recovery. To help realize this, we outlined a 4-point agenda in our theme study to assist countries post-COVID-19: broadening social protection, investing in a sustained recovery, strengthening connectivity and supply chain, and mending a broken relationship with nature. First, social protection should be extended to all, including informal workers, women, and vulnerable groups, to ensure future pandemics do not widen existing inequalities. Second, our analysis indicated that creating the fiscal space needed for the region's recovery is possible, but requires innovative approaches to both taxation and expenditure prioritization. Next, the region's trade and transport links, so critical to sustaining economic activity and keeping vital supplies moving during the pandemic, must be enhanced by greater digitalization and broadband connectivity. And lastly, the study reinforces the concept of planetary health, advocating that countries integrate this idea into national and regional policy agendas. This is vital if we are to ensure that long-term systemic changes, institutional, structural, and behavioral, are made to protect the environment and mitigate the risk of future pandemics. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, COVID-19 continues to challenge our societies and economies. We still have some way to go to build our defenses against the virus and safeguard population. Despite the challenges we are facing, our common agenda must be to plan for the post-pandemic era. As we plan for life after COVID-19, we must ensure we stay on course to achieve the SDGs and tackle climate change. The pandemic has taught us that inequalities in our societies make us all weaker. It has shown that undermining the health of the environment is to the detriment of our own physical health, and that, together with the twin crisis of climate change, these issues are not fading away and will require more concerted efforts. Thus, as the region's economic engine restarts, we must recognize the need to do things differently and seize key opportunities to shape the recovery as a truly green and sustainable transformation. We can do this more effectively if we cooperate more closely to tackle systemic issues, build capacity, and replicate and scale up our successes. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to learning more from the perspective of the distinguished delegates and experts with us today. Your discussion will help build on the strong foundations of analysis and dialogue already established. I wish you a very successful deliberation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Executive Secretary, for your kind welcome. I would now like to pass the floor to our moderator, Mr. Michael Williamson of ESCAP, who will be moderating the panel session. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody in the Asia Pacific, where it is a bit late into the night. We really appreciate you joining us for these discussions. So, Madam Executive Secretary, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the panel session. And we are very fortunate to be able to be joined by several high-level representatives from across the Asia Pacific region. And in fact, they will be sharing with us their perspectives on this complex issue at hand, which is about the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we very much would like to understand their ideas and suggestions about how the region can structure this recovery, keeping in mind particularly the synergies with the Sustainable Development Goals and the transition to a low-carbon future. So in the panel, we're going to really take it in two parts. The first part, I think, is about thinking about the recoveries for recovering better, using the framework proposed in ESCAP's theme study, and that proposes 4 tracks for recovery: broadening social protection, investing in sustained recovery, strengthening connectivity and supply chains, and mending the broken relationship with nature. So in the first part of the panel, I'd like to zero in on each of these areas by asking each panelist in turn to respond to one of these areas. And then secondly, having understood a little bit about some of these strategies, how to realize progress on these tracks, I'd like to turn to the issue of regional cooperation. How can we tap into the potential of Asia Pacific's existing robust intergovernmental cooperation to help put this recovery on track? So in doing so, I'd like to prompt a forward-looking discussion on recovering better together. And I know that many of you are joining on YouTube, and we'd really welcome your questions and comments and ideas. So please pop them into the comments box, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce our distinguished panelists, and maybe each panelist, if their camera works, just to put on your camera as we welcome you. Firstly, I'd like to welcome the Honourable Merasini Rakuita Vuniwaka. She's the Minister for Women, Children and Poverty Alleviation of the Government of Fiji. And she is joining us from New York, where she's been an active participant in the HLPF. So a warm welcome to you, Minister. Secondly, Her Excellency Ms. Rosemary Edilion. She's the Undersecretary of National Economic and Development Authority of the Philippines. Again, another stalwart of Asia-Pacific regional cooperation, who's really been a strong supporter of ESCAP's efforts in regional cooperation. A warm welcome to you, Ms. Edilion. And I'm not sure if our representative from Pakistan has been able to join us yet. Hopefully he will join at some point in our conversation. He is Mr. Mohammed Irfan Tariq, the Director General of Environment and Climate Change, Ministry of Climate Change, Pakistan. And we hope to touch on climate change issues in our discussion. So I really hope that he can join. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Anju Mangal. She's the Asia Regional Coordinator of the Alliance for Affordable Internet in the World Wide Web Foundation. So she's actually based in Fiji, a country which really, relies on digital connectivity. And I hope that she can bring out some of these perspectives for us about closing this digital divide. So maybe if I could start with our deliberations on the panel by inviting Honourable Minister Vuniwaka of Fiji to take the floor. Minister, if I could ask you, we have seen how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable people in society, certain segments of society, for example, the informal workers, different vulnerable groups. And at ESCAP, in our analysis, we pointed to the need for countries to broaden social protection by spending 2 to 6% of GDP to lift people out of poverty and to enhance resilience against future pandemics. So what is your perspective on this challenge, Minister, particularly for the smaller developing countries? So in the space of maybe 5 to 7 minutes, if you go a bit longer, it's okay. You could give us your perspective. So Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Madam Executive Secretary, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Fijian government, I wish to thank the governments of Pakistan and the Philippines for co-sponsoring and ESCAP for hosting this very important panel. The COVID-19 crisis has distressed our societies and economies across the globe and our region. Governments have had to take unprecedented actions to respond to health, economic, and social impacts of the pandemic. COVID-19 has confronted us with the reality and consequences of the multiple and growing inequalities in our societies, and at the same time, it has made these inequalities worse. We can see, if we care and if we dare to look, how they have hardened into deep structural injustice. The experience of this pandemic for some has been of inconvenience, stress, and frustration. For others, and many in our region, it's been about fear, lack of safety and protection, poverty, and survival. COVID-19 at the same time highlighted in bold the significant gaps in the coverage and sufficiency of our existing social protection systems, in a context that the usual clientele of the system expanded and evolved to include everyone hit the hardest by the crisis. And the inadequacy to protect them means that the vast majority of people, especially in developing countries, are vulnerable to extreme economic shocks. The recommendation by ESCAP to widen social protection by spending 2 to 6% of our GDP in order to lift people out of poverty and enhance resilience against future pandemics should therefore be welcomed, contextualized, and adopted. In Fiji, expenditure on the social protection scheme assistance is significant, with social welfare allowances alone amounting to 1.4% of the total government's budget. This, of course, does not include other non-cash interventions like free education, subsidized cost of water and power, and the list goes on. In addition, since the start of the pandemic, the Fiji National Provident Fund, our superannuation fund, in partnership with the Fijian government, rolled out relief packages. The packages were in 4 phases until now and catered for individuals who lost their jobs and livelihoods before, during, and because of the pandemic. Government also provided different types of cash top-ups to those who did not fall into the above category, living within COVID-19 containment zones. Most importantly, while the Fijian government retained the normal social protection assistance of government, including social welfare allowances, free healthcare in government hospitals, and education-related schemes, we worked with bilateral and multilateral partners to provide top-up assistance to certain groups of welfare recipients. But most importantly, we had to recognize and sought to fill significant coverage gaps in our social protection systems. This was our opportunity to develop Fiji's first ever targeted social assistance policy, which was adopted in January 2021. This policy provides a framework for targeted social assistance programs to uplift the poor and vulnerable Fijians through inclusive, efficient, and adaptive provision of social assistance programs, flexible to scale horizontally and vertically in the event of crisis, whilst ensuring sound management of government resources through efficient operational mechanisms. I'm pleased to highlight that the vision for the government of Fiji is to promote the progressive realization of the universal right to social protection, to reduce poverty and social exclusion by delivering targeted and adaptable social assistance programs, protecting the poor and vulnerable against shocks, including those from climate-related disasters, promoting security and building resilience so that Fijians are able to fully participate economically, socially, and culturally.
I'm sorry, Minister, we lost your audio. I wonder, would you be kind enough just to unmute one of the computers that you have?
Michael.
Oh, we have you back now. Please proceed.
Thank you. We recognize that crises and shocks exacerbate, in particular, existing gender inequalities, vulnerabilities, and risks. Therefore, we are committed to achieve the goal of gender-responsive social assistance programs that can reduce these risks and vulnerabilities by extending coverage of social protection assistance and quality public services for women over their life cycle, and in particular for those in informal and precarious work, while ensuring social assistance programs respond to the risks of gender-based violence and integrate approaches to prevent violence against all women and girls. So, Michael, to me, investment in people is central to our collective social, political, and economic development and achieving the 2030 agenda, with a promise to leave no one behind. I understand that according to ILO, low-income countries must invest approximately $80 billion, nearly 16% of their GDP, to guarantee at least basic income security and access to essential health care for all. Domestic resources in our countries are not nearly enough. So the proposal by ESCAP to invest the required level of money into social protection systems across our countries is highly welcomed and is the only way, I believe, to ensure that our economies are resilient and ready for pandemics like COVID has imposed on us. Thank you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for bringing out a series of important points. And as you were speaking, I was thinking how interconnected all of this. I mean, what you said flows directly to our discussions about the digital divide, and it also links into what our next speaker will cover, which will be about the fiscal space. How do we manage the revenue and expenditure side of the budget to be able to do all of these things? So to continue on that theme, I'd like to welcome our next panelist, Her Excellency Ms. Rosemary Dillon. She is the Secretary of the National Economic and Development Authority of the Philippines. So, Excellency, the question I would like to put to you is that, as crisis spending gives way to long-term economic recovery from COVID-19, an unprecedented effort is needed to unlock the fiscal space needed to support this recovery. So we need interventions in terms of both expenditure and revenue, and these offer opportunity to decarbonize major sectors of the economy. So I work in the energy division of ESCAP, so I'm always thinking about the energy sector and the decarbonization of energy. But how do you see these opportunities, and what lessons could we take away from the Philippines in how you've approached this challenge? So, Undersecretary, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to be sharing with you our experiences. It's still current. How I wish I could say that looking back, because it's still happening as I speak. But I'd like to share three insights here. One is that is the need for informed planning, where we really take stock of lessons learned and also best practices so that we can build back better. Next is that government must really be sensitive to the needs of the people, especially if you're talking about tax reform. It requires, at this point in time in the pandemic, government must first be sensitive. Three is that as we introduce changes, we need to secure the buy-in of all who are involved, the stakeholders, getting all of them to collectively aspire for a better future. Now, one of the things that we did was really to listen to the people, know their utmost concern and fears. We conducted an online survey early on, and this was during the first week of April last year, and we were just on our third week into our very strict lockdown. So we just wanted to find out what is their utmost fear, utmost concern, and how is this lockdown affecting them in many aspects. We actually had almost 400,000 individual respondents and about 40,000 business respondents, almost 10,000 farmers. Now, actually, the assistance program that we implemented afterwards was informed by the results of that survey. And then later on, we were encouraged by the success, quote unquote, of that survey. We would do virtual focus group discussions. We would do crowdsourcing. We would throw out questions like, describe the new normal. How do you think can we thrive in the new normal? what changes do you see under the new normal? So apart from being able to listen to them, and apart from getting really fantastic answers from ordinary people, of course, some of them are not so ordinary. What happened was that we were able to start the conversation. We were able to get them actually to think about the new normal, and more importantly, to think that it's something doable and that we can actually build back better. So in fact, we also made use of this information to update our Philippine development plan, where our goal is to have a healthy and resilient Philippines. Now, a big lesson that we have learned, I suppose, from this COVID-19 is the importance of having good air quality, in fact, proper ventilation wherever you are. And another is to have a healthy lifestyle so that one does not develop comorbidities. And I think we can use this to inform our programs on sustainable development. Some of the programs actually to pursue, to promote sustainable development and at the same time better health and lifestyle, we have begun during the pandemic. One is the urban decongestion program, where we encourage people who were working in the national capital region but had roots outside of the NCR to go back to their roots. So government provided the resettlement assistance as well as assistance for retraining and even livelihood assistance. We also started a new transport policy. Of course, we also had to put in some more restrictions in our transport systems. But apart from that, we made use of this opportunity to promote active mobility infrastructure for bikers and for the walkers. I understand that you're also with the energy. Actually, early on in the pandemic, we realized that there will be a lot more of this work from home arrangements, and that energy requirements could be higher. And so we have also engaged with our Department of Energy to encourage them to expand their program on renewable energy, beginning with the home-based and the small-scale systems. However, or I would say that fortuitously, before the pandemic, we have already finished our Philippine Action Plan for Sustainable Consumption and Production. So we finished it in December of 2019. And where the basic principle we observe there is the need to encourage behavioral change. And so even during the pandemic, we are working on little by little, just on those that require executive action, on those that on those policy reforms, even the education and promotion that would promote the sustainable consumption and production. Now, you mentioned about the need to actually have more fiscal space in order to get this, in order to build back better. So we know that the key is digital transformation. We need resources to modify systems, lay out the necessary infrastructure, train more people, and so on and so forth. Now, again, in the case of the Philippines, we have started our tax reform program even before the pandemic, and we were just following, so to speak, a reform agenda here. And what we also saw, what we were able to do again during the pandemic was to work with our legislature in order to have this a radical tax and incentive reform program, where at the outset, what happens is that the corporate income tax is reduced right away. So actually, in order to balance that, because it's a fiscally neutral reform program, there will also be reforms in the incentive system. But what we have done, again, having to do with being sensitive first to the needs of the times, is for this incentive program to have a longer transition period. But the message is clear that we want them to go towards a different incentive regime, where we will be incentivizing, those businesses and also those location decisions that we think are akin or aligned with our development and even our sustainable development agenda. Improvements in tax administration is another key strategy. Actually, this pandemic has forced us to leapfrog the digitalization of our processes In fact, comparing the first quarter of this year to the first quarter of last year, we actually saw a slight increase in tax revenue, and certainly higher than what we initially programmed. And we have already tried to look for what was the reason for that, given the economic contraction, etc. And it's really about the more efficient tax collection. It's about higher tax compliance. It's also because we were able to finish all those other improvements in tax administration, like fuel, stamping, etc. So all this actually worked to improve the revenue collection, even at this time. Of course, expenditure management, trimming off the fat. And another thing we did beginning last year was to really look at the infrastructure projects that we have in the pipeline and prioritize those for which which are what we call shovel ready. So we have already come up with the detailed engineering, the right-of-way has been acquired, etc. And this will be given priority in terms of funding, realizing that there's the opportunity cost of funds. And so that's another way that we were able to make space, so to speak, for this COVID-related spending. And going forward, we're actually implementing a major initiative to improve the efficiency of service delivery. I'm talking about our national IT system, which has a very sophisticated back office authentication system. We have actually laid out somewhere, actually, policy reform agenda. It's been in the previous, in the original Philippine Development Plan, but we are continuing on with it in the updated PDP. And it's really meant to promote sustainable development. And it's actually also aligned with Building Back Better. So I just want to go back to those three insights that I would like to share. That first has to be informed planning, taking stock of all lessons learned and all those best practices. Be sensitive to the needs of the people, and then making sure that we are able to collectively get the buy-in of our stakeholders and get them to collectively aspire for a better future. In the case of the Philippines, we refer to this as the Ambition Natin 2040, where every Filipino wishes to enjoy strong family and community ties, a comfortable lifestyle, and a secure future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Under Secretary Idilog. I think you brought out a number of very rich examples. This was very, very useful. I think we all agree the pandemic is maybe one of the biggest shocks that we've had in our lives. It's really forced us to think freshly about so many topics, about how we work, how we travel, what's the future of cities, what's the future of transportation. And I think it's beholden upon all of us to take what we can from this crisis and turn it into something better for the future. So a lot of what you said is geared towards that objective, I think. So thank you very much for those inputs. So dear participants, what I might do is maybe skip to the final speaker of the panel because we are still hoping that our representative from Pakistan may be able to join us. I understand he's been called away to a cabinet meeting, which does happen from time to time. So we may have to skip the perspective from Pakistan. But I'm very pleased to turn to our final topic, which is about bridging the digital divide. It's a topic which has really come into light during the pandemic. It's been growing in importance for a number of years. But we're going to return to the Pacific, where we have our final panelist, Ms. Anju Mangal. She's joined us from Fiji, and she's the head of Asia Pacific of the Alliance for Affordable Internet of the World Wide Web Foundation. So, Ms. Mangal, one thing the pandemic has taught us is that digital technologies and internet access play a really critical role in managing this crisis. We know that there's inequality of access to reliable and affordable broadband, both between countries and within countries themselves. And there's also a gender-based digital divide. So from your perspective, what are the key elements of this challenge? And maybe you could share with us some ideas on how to bridge the digital divide to enhance our future resistance to pandemics. So Ms. Anju, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael. I will not be doing a PowerPoint presentation, so thank you. Your Excellencies, colleagues from ESCAP, and our wonderful guests and audience, Pula Vinaka and Namaste to all. It's a pleasure to join today's meeting. Many of you are facing challenges, but I hope you're all safe. Just before I dive into that question, Michael, I just wanted to share a bit about the work that I do. So I work for the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which is an initiative of the World Wide Web Foundation, and we are the broadest technology sector alliance working to drive down the price of broadband, and this is done through transforming policy and regulatory reforms. And we have more than 100 members around the world, and our partners endorse the same principles. We want to ensure that the web and internet remains open, safe, and secure for all. And with the current pandemic, we see a huge digital divide, and some of our communities are struggling, including women and girls, persons with disability, and also rural and remote communities, And I appreciate what Her Excellency Meriseni Vuniwanga said, that they have been providing incentives for women and girls in particular, which I love, during the whole COVID. And we've seen quite a lot of great initiatives coming out in Fiji. And also Her Excellency Rosemary Adalon about the need to have investments to ensure recovery for all sectors, which is really key if we want to reduce the digital gap. So reducing the digital gap and also the gender gap has been a key priority for us. And we work with women and girls in particular, persons with disabilities and vulnerable groups to amplify their voices. And as a result of the pandemic, we see more people online. So we have a team that focuses on online gender-based violence and tech policy hubs for women and girls. And as part of the recent generation equality work, we continue to engage tech giants like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Google, and urgently trying to prioritize the safety of women on their platforms. And obviously, they have committed towards making design safety features for women and girls. So this is very important when we are trying to bridge the digital gap. And the reality is that we need around $428 billion, which will, if you want to achieve universal access to broadband connectivity, I think this means that this investment is definitely needed. And this is showing across South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, because they account for around half of the unconnected population, and around 55% of required investment is particularly needed to reduce the gap. But it's not just an infrastructure problem to reduce the digital gap, but we need to look at some complementary initiatives. So, for example, programs to increase and support device affordability of data and services, making sure that we have digital programs running throughout during the pandemic as well. And again, with a special focus on reducing the digital gap. And what we look at from our perspective in terms of affordability is meaningful connectivity. And the true value of the internet will remain out of reach if we don't have meaningful connectivity. So, for example, making sure that students and teachers have regular internet access, making sure that communities, particularly women and girls, are not left out of the digital economy. And also they have access to affordable and appropriate device. And, making sure that women and girls who are working from home during a pandemic have access to 4G internet connection and regular data. And to us, it's about affordability again, and it becomes a huge issue, especially when you have a family of 5 using broadband connectivity at the same time. And we know the reality, data runs out quickly. So what are we really doing? For us, without evidence, we can't find solutions. So we have been doing quite a lot of digital gender scorecards and audits, and we keep asking ourselves, what are the policy steps that countries can do to close the digital gap and ensure digital inclusion, and how can we talk to the policymakers so that they can take immediate action to say making sure that we have focus on rights, education, access, content, and targets to close the digital gap. We've been working with so many different partners in Asia and also the Pacific. But the good news is that we've done so many different scorecards in Asia in particular. But we are going to be engaging a few countries in the Pacific and trying to come up with ways to look at the audits and look at the gender divide. And we monitor the progress being made towards the closing the digital divide, because everything that we do has to be committed towards the SDGs that we have, in particular SDG 9C. And when we look at a score, for example, if it's 3 out of 10, that means we need to work on a lot of the opportunities. And a lot of the data that we've collected shows that there is a huge gender divide, for example, and it implies that women still remain unconnected and ignored. And in some countries, we see a huge disparity between men and women using smartphones, for example, and some women are not even having access to these smartphones. So what are we trying to do? For example, in Bangladesh, despite the lockdown, we worked on this digital skills program, and we had around 700 plus students and teachers joining from all over Bangladesh. And majority were women and girls that were part of the digital skills training. So we are organizing a lot of these workshops, particularly for women and girls, and to ensure that they lead these discussions and they tell the policymakers how to reduce the gap, instead of us being the ones telling people how to reduce it. And we continue to work with governments, telcos, mobile operators. We also have public-private partnerships to provide recommendations to bring down the cost of mobile devices, particularly for women and students. We look at reducing taxes on devices, and this includes like laptops, desktops for students or families. And right now, in partnership with ESCAP, I have to say that we're looking at good practices and case studies in terms of what is the progress across different countries in terms of achieving meaningful connectivity. And one of the things that we've made clear about in doing the study is that we need to have that emphasis to ensure that we close the digital divide, but looking at how can we provide incentives particularly for women and girls to ensure that they have internet access, but also looking at other marginalized groups like persons with disabilities. So we've been trying to prioritize a lot of our activities and also initiatives for them. I'm going to keep it at that right now, but happy to provide more update later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mangal, and I could hear the passion coming through in your presentation. I agree with you. This is such an important area, and we always at ESCAP try to emphasize that access to the internet is not a luxury; it's a necessity in the modern world, and it's a tool for fighting poverty. It's so important in so many spheres. It underpins paperless trade. This whole system of reducing the friction between countries in terms of trade. It's important in the energy sector, for poverty alleviation, for small-scale farmers, for so many things. So thank you for bringing out some of those issues. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our next speaker. It's actually the representative from the government of Pakistan. It's Mr. Mohammad Irfan Tariq. He's the Director General of Environment and Climate Change in the Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan, a relatively new ministry. So, Mr. Tariq, I hope that you can hear us and see us okay. We're very happy to welcome you to this forum. And the question that I would like to put to you is that the pandemic that we're all going through, it's highlighted the fraught relationship that humans have with the environment. So we've had loss of habitat and ecosystem damage, which creates more opportunities for zoonotic transmission of diseases. So given the economic stakes that we've seen by pandemics, such as COVID-19, how should we reassess our relationship with nature and our approach to development and planetary health? So, Mr. Tariq, if you're able to hear us, you'd be very welcome to take the floor. Okay, I think we lost Mr. Tarek, which is very unfortunate because climate change and the environment is a key part of this whole conversation. And at ESCAP, when we wrote the theme study, we had a chapter on environment, which followed very closely the themes raised in this question. And that chapter was co-authored by some of my colleagues here, Katinka and Ricardo. It was actually one of the most difficult chapters to write of this theme study, because untangling these issues about the environment, development, and how human activities are creating pathways for more zoonotic transmission of disease is a really, really key question. So we did have Mr. Tarek online before, but he dropped off. I understand he had some important meetings, but we will try and come back to him later in the conversation, and maybe we might have some other contributions from other colleagues to talk a little bit more about this area. But I think what we might do now, with your permission, is to move to the second part of the conversation, which is about regional cooperation. So we've talked about these areas, about the social protection, creating physical space, and we've talked about the digital divide. But how do countries of the region work together to further these pathways to recovery? So I'd like to go as far as I can to each panel member for a brief response. And I know that we as the organizers have tasked you to respond to a specific aspect of this question, but in your answer, don't feel free to go beyond that. I think we'd welcome your views on any of the pathways. So for example, if you talked about physical space and you want to talk more about digital, that's perfectly okay. It's quite open. So I wonder, maybe first I could turn to the minister from Fiji. If you could share with us your thoughts on regional cooperation to progress these 4 tracks of COVID recovery. Over to you, Minister.
I think oftentimes we underestimate the rich experience that's available in the region. Within countries, the different initiatives that each government has come up with to address the multiple challenges that we face in this day and era. In Fiji, for example, during the COVID pandemic, when COVID hit us in March 2020, within that period, we were also hit by 2 Category 5 cyclones. We already had a social protection system in place with over 80,000 Fijians and their data online. Basically, their data was with us. And because the cyclone hit only specific parts of Fiji really badly, we were able to immediately top up the accounts of our clientele, the social protection beneficiaries that were in the hardest hit areas. The ability to build a resilient social protection system is more important now than ever, especially for us in the Asia-Pacific region and the existential threat of climate change. The different challenges that climate change will bring will enable us, should enable us, and should really gear our minds towards the building of a social protection system that is not only resilient, but adaptable. And that's proven very useful for us. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to learn from each other. But for that to happen, we need a think tank. I see it as like maybe an institution somewhere. Is it ESCAP or is it another institution in the region that could be the base for this evidence, this best practice within the region, countries facing similar challenges, picking on what each government has been able to come up with to assist their nationals during times of pandemic or during a climate disaster. And therein is the nexus between the different topics that we're supposed to talk about today, I think. The digital divide is an important one for us as well. At the moment, we are 110 inhabited islands. And on these islands are our social welfare beneficiaries. And I see digital technology as the most efficient and effective way of reaching out to our social protection clientele. But apart from that, Michael, the second and final point I wanted to draw on is the impact of COVID on the beneficiaries of our social welfare recipients. What I'm saying is maybe what is referred to as the missing middle. After this, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are now looking at a category of Fijians that would not necessarily have fallen into our initial policy, our policy for targeted social assistance, but have been put into that because of the impact of COVID, those who have lost their jobs and their livelihoods because of COVID. So the net is definitely increasing in a very big way, the number of Fijians that will now need to come into the fold. So again, back to the proposal by ESCAP. And on that, I'd just like to make a correction. I'd said 1.4% of our social protection is 1.4% of our national budget. It's actually 1.4% of our GDP. So we're almost up to the 2% threshold on allowances alone. This is not to talk about non-cash assistance to our nationals. We're almost up to the 2%, but just looking at the 1.4% that we are now giving as cash assistance and the impact of COVID, 2% is the bare minimum, really, when we look at the impact of COVID in that context. So it's a great proposal as a start-off point for nations to look at how much they're investing into social protection, and as a bare minimum, ensure that it is 2% for cash allowances alone, not including the other non-cash assistance that government gives. So yes, I welcome the proposal that's been put in the table for 2 to 6% of GDPs to be invested into social protection, knowing that this is the one sure way of assisting our people, especially those who are marginalized, the vulnerable during the pandemic, and not only because of the pandemic, because us, the Asia-Pacific region, as a region, we're disproportionately impacted by the existential threat of climate change. Thank you, Mr. Williamson, thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. So I think you made a number of very good points there. And I think the essence of a lot of what you were saying is that, COVID is in many ways an unprecedented challenge. None of us have a playbook. We don't have experience of this kind of thing. So when it comes to the response of governments and of organizations to it, you have innovation popping up everywhere. And I think the challenge is, how do you sort of get the best innovations from different places and share those and make them available? Because every government, every country has different responses to the crisis because it manifests itself in slightly different ways, and human beings are innovative. We come up with great solutions. So the more that we can scale those up and share them, the better. Absolutely. So on the same topic of regional cooperation, maybe I could move to the Philippines, to Undersecretary Adilon, who gave us a very rich kind of account of what the Philippines has done in response to COVID. But Undersecretary, what are your perspectives on regional cooperation? How should we be working together more across borders in the Asia Pacific?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, this COVID-19 has revealed to us that there's an intricate relationship between and amongst health, the economy, and the environment. So previous to COVID, we already know that we need cooperation for economic development. So there has been a lot of economic cooperation agreements. There has been a lot of this economic partnership. And with respect to environment, I think the Paris Agreement has really brought home this commitment and this recognition that environmental stewardship is actually a shared responsibility amongst everyone. But the COVID-19 has actually put in the spotlight that health is also a shared responsibility, and that it can affect every one of us. That there is such a thing as this pandemic, an infectious respiratory disease. And we are seeing that with this experience, we're seeing that something like in the case of the Philippines, some countries are just a month ahead of us in terms of the experience of going through this COVID-19. And so that information exchange is really very important. It was really very, very important to us so that we would see what happened to them and how they responded. And we're also very much looking at all the researches being done by the advanced countries. And therefore, I think going forward, that is the way to go. We need more of the researchers. Of course, those in the developing countries and the least developed countries do not have the resources to do this. But we are willing to learn, and we are willing to cooperate however we can. The important thing is to have this information exchange. Now, this has also brought to light this COVID-19 pandemic, that there are some countries, even the richer ones, that are very dependent on other countries also for their sustenance. The problem was in some countries have restricted trade on food and on basic necessities, on this active ingredients, the active pharmaceutical ingredients. There was a time that there was trade restriction on that. I think there has to be a commitment to coming up with a regional stockpile of sorts for these basic commodities, just to ensure that having another pandemic like this will not lead to an existential threat to us, especially those in the poor countries. And of course, still, as we very well know, this is a zoonotic disease. It's really because of the unbridled development going into the habitats of actually the animal kingdom, and that is why you have this transmission of these zoonotic diseases. And therefore, it's really important that we do more research in that. We are able to manage well how to have this this symbiotic relationship, this harmonious relationship, so to speak, with the environment. Again, recognizing the lessons of this COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, there should always be that commitment to information exchange, to unrestricted trade, especially with respect to the basic necessities, and going back to environmental stewardship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary. There's a lot of food for thought in what you said. I think we're reminded that COVID is not one single crisis, it's a series of overlapping crises. There's a health crisis at the core, but beyond that, there's a social crisis and an economic crisis. And within all of those, there are solutions that lend themselves to more international cooperation. I'm really interested in the idea of regional stockpiles, because when we talk about critical things such as PPE and ventilators, in the early part of the crisis, there was a huge surge to scale up the manufacturing of those, and terrible shortages, and those shortages led to loss of life. You know, if you think about the criticality of these issues, so having a stockpile which can essentially manage the fact that different countries are at different points in the crisis, so that stockpile can play a really valuable role to supply the equipment to those who need it the most. And I think, we in ESCAP, we focus, of course, on the economic and social environmental dimensions. Our colleague in the World Health Organization look after the health crisis aspect, but we need to remind ourselves the level of global cooperation on health has been unprecedented in terms of sharing information about therapeutics, about vaccine development and distribution of key equipment. There's been a huge amount of work in that area, which is really needs to be noted. So I think there's a lot of really good ideas we can capture. But I wanted to move along to Ms. Mangle to speak a little bit about her perspective, because Ms. Mangle, you had spoken about the digital divide. Obviously, the World Wide Web is a regional, a global infrastructure, and in many ways, it's a meta infrastructure. It's infrastructure that allows other systems to operate. It almost underpins everything. And ESCAP has talked for many years about this Asia Pacific information superhighway. And we've emphasized that regional cooperation has a big role to play. But I suppose it's more than that. It's just the infrastructure. It's about access to the devices that you were talking about. It's about the skills and capacities that people need to utilize these technologies. So what are your suggestions in terms of how we can leverage regional cooperation to close this digital divide?
Thanks, Michael. When we talk about the Asia Superhighway Initiative, we, of course, look at the priorities for small island states, but also low and middle income countries that are struggling. And when you come up with a plan, you make sure that each partner brings something to the table. I know that we continue to encourage meaningful connectivity, affordability, bringing down the cost of devices and prices of internet. Those things are very relevant to us, but without a national coalition, without a multi-stakeholder approach, I don't think we can achieve it. And I will not take credit for anything that I'm currently doing, because without my members, without the countries, without the people that we work with, particularly people who are working on the ground to reduce the digital gap, we can completely amplify their voices, and we want to make sure that they're included. And I'm glad that Honorable Marisani brought the issue about dealing with the pandemic, but also dealing with disasters at the same time. And you can see this across a lot of the Asia and Pacific countries. When we look at digital divide, we need to think about the realities. And some islands and countries face problems such as electricity issues. So how can we ensure that countries have internet access, but they're able to have access to electricity to actually charge their phones or to be able to connect to their devices? And every country is different. Yes, there are many similarities, but there's also a lot of differences, and we should not underestimate what the ability that the government does in terms of, providing key solutions, because they have their own challenges. And we want to ensure that we work with national coalitions and stakeholders. One aspect is to develop the policies that improve affordability, meaningful connectivity, etc. But then the other aspect is coming up with a good action plan that looks at an all-inclusive approach. And I think one of the things that I've seen recently is that having cross-sectoral approaches in ensuring how to bridge the digital divide is key, because you invite key sectors like renewable energy sector, health, education, to find the real solutions and to test it, because at the end of the day, we need to think about a design thinking solution that is not just about technology, but it's about people and the process. And echoing what others have said, without significant investments from regional and international organizations in particular, I don't think we can reach and reduce the digital gap. I mean, we are trying to reduce the digital gap by 2030. And we have so much work to do. And I feel that we may not reach unless and until we have a cohesive and a more coordinated approach. And like you said, having the Asia Pacific Superhighway Master Plan could be a significant way forward in terms of achieving this. But I think we really need to be realistic about some of these priorities, because sometimes we depend too much on the countries to come up with the solutions without actually realizing that they need a lot of investments to reduce the digital gap. So I think it can be a win-win situation if you have good partnership. I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Mangal. Colleagues, distinguished participants, I had mentioned that our guest from Pakistan was unable to join, and he was scheduled to speak about a very important part of the whole puzzle, which is about environment and climate change and mending the broken relationship with nature. But what I would like to do maybe is, well, first of all, the absence of Mr. Tariq has meant that we have an all-female panel. So I think that is something to note. It's quite rare, but we should congratulate all of the panelists and the opening speaker for an all-female show today, which has been really excellent, because the quality of the presentations coming through has been really, really good. But I'd like to continue the theme of an all-female contribution, because my colleague Katinka Weinberger was the author of the chapter of the theme study that covered this issue of mending the broken relationship with nature. And I thought it would be inappropriate to leave this discussion without at least giving a couple of insights into this really important area of COVID-19 recovery. So Katinka, can I pass the floor to you for your intervention?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thanks much for this opportunity. And of course, actually I think all of our previous speakers had already touched on the importance of the environment. And maybe just make me let a couple of points here in that I think there's no doubt that the achievement of the 2030 agenda is threatened by a number of really mutually reinforcing environmental risks. And we see the concrete outcome of that with the current pandemic going on. We have changes in climate, land degradation, biodiversity loss, and pollution, which all impede progress on the SDGs. And at the same time, the cost of this environmental risk is also really high. We know, for example, that damages from climate-related natural disasters costed us more than $155 billion in 2018 alone. And there are many other costs related to, for example, pollinators, which threaten annual global crop outputs worth 235 to 577 billion. So just from that cost element also, there's a real good and strong narrative to put more emphasis on addressing these environmental risks. And of course, and I think that also came out through earlier interventions during this very interesting side event, while the burden of the environmental decline is felt by all, it's really the poorest and the most vulnerable that are disproportionately impacted. So I think there is good recognition at all levels that we really require a very urgent change to break with the current trends that we see in environmental decline, and to go forward in the next 10 years up to 2030. And at the same time also, there's probably no doubt that the knowledge that we have together, our ingenuity, technology, and cooperation together can really help to transform societies and economies and work towards a sustainable future. So our theme study had argued that we require a system-wide transformation to achieve well-being for all. And that the interconnected nature of environmental issues requires a very holistic response, which really addresses all of the issues together. And this needs to be supported by changes, real changes in economic and financial systems to really transform the shift and lead to a change in power relationships towards sustainability. So this includes, for example, shifting away from environmentally harmful subsidies and investing in low carbon and sustainable solutions and technologies, and also in internalizing environmental and social costs. And what we're arguing is that such considerations should really play a key role now as governments are putting together their recovery packages post-COVID-19. So let me, just try and complete these very short remarks that as part of this change, I think it's really important that all of us contribute to changing our consumption habits. This is at the level of consumers, of individuals who can enable a transformation through their voting patterns, by changing their habits, by reducing consumption, and also by promoting behavioral change in their communities. This is at the level of governments, who can initiate intergovernmental cooperation, policies and legislation to transform society. So let me just close by saying I think that really everybody has a role to play in transforming the social and the economic systems that we really require for a sustainable future. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Thank you, Katinka, for jumping in at such short notice. I think you did a great job as an impromptu contribution there. That was very, very clear. And I think from what you've said is that the current model isn't working. It's not working not just for the current generation, but it won't work for the future generation. because the level of environmental degradation that we've seen, and when we look at the planetary tipping points and extinctions and a range of other indicators, we're really not going in the right direction. So let's hope that COVID wakes us up a little bit and causes us to think about setting a new direction. So I must report that it's a little bit quiet in terms of comments from the audience. I think that's a product of such excellent presentations which have explored the issues in great detail. So we don't have too many questions from the audience, but I think that we've managed to flesh out the questions that we as the organizers have proposed to you very, very well. So maybe what I will do is maybe attempt to sum up a little bit and close, and maybe allow those of you participating in the HLPF to get to the next appointment, which I think will start at 9 a.m. sharp New York time. But I really wanted to thank all of you, the panelists, and also the participants for taking part. It's very late in the night in Suva and Fiji, so Miss Anju, I really appreciate you staying up. Miss Edilion, I'm not sure if you're in Manila or New York, but either way, it's some lost sleep to join us. I really appreciate it. And Minister Vuniwaka, also appreciate you, and very nice to see you again on screen after supporting the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank all of our panel members for taking part. I'd like to thank our Executive Secretary, Ibu Armida, for her welcome. And I wish all of you very well for your participation in the rest of the high-level political forum. Thank you for support to ESCAP in regional cooperations recovering from COVID-19. I think all of your ideas contribute to what we're doing. They eventually form part of our knowledge products and our advice to government. So all of these sessions are really, really important. And I thank you very much. On our side, I'd like to thank Katinka, Ricardo, and Kun Serena and Kun Kijiwat working behind the scenes to make this happen. But on behalf of ESCAP, thank you very much. And I wish you all a very pleasant day ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Keep safe.
Thank you.